Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Nelson, here on this wonderful Thursday afternoon, and we have a couple of different segments that we are going to be talking about. So the first one is going to be just an update with the WNBA regarding Cameron Brink and her unfortunate injury that is most likely going to sideline her for the rest of the season. So we're just going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to be doing something that I said I was going to do in the previous podcast. So I wanted to do a recap of all of the rounds that happened in the playoffs, sort of what I thought about it. And now given that we have hindsight and clarity on the whole playoffs as a whole, now I can give my deep opinions on every single team that was playing, how they played, and all those things that I thought. So in the second segment, we're going to do the conference finals. Then in the third segment, we're going to do the semi-conference finals on both sides. And then in the fourth segment, we are going to do a playoff recap for, the first round. And since there's a lot of teams that played in the first round, I'm going to save that for the fourth and the fifth segment. So be sure to stay in tune towards the end of the podcast to see what I have to say about those playoff teams. Now, before I begin, I'd like to remind everybody to please use the link in the description to get your comments recognized, or the link displayed below the ticker on every single show segment. That is GSMCPodcast.net. It really helps the show, makes the show much more interactive between myself and you guys. Once again, the link is GSMCPodcast.net. And with that out of the way, let's go right ahead and go into the first segment of our podcast today, which is going to be all about Cameron Brink and the LA Sparks and sort of her status with the team. Unfortunately, she went down with a very big injury recently, and it's most likely going to sideline her for the rest of the season. So she ended up tearing her ACL in her left knee. Excuse me, my bad. But yeah, she ended up tearing her ACL in her left knee. As we all know, tearing your ACL, it's a very serious injury, and it most likely will sideline you for the rest of the season. And you won't be able, it takes a long time to sort of recover from that, have the surgery from that as well. If the person is going to even have surgery, if they even need surgery, depends on the treatment. We still don't know all of that yet with Cameron Brink, but she is one of the top rookies in her class. She's also very popular. She played on UCLA. She was a great scoring option, and she still is a great scoring option. She does everything on the court, and it's very, very impressive. And unfortunately, her rookie season is not going to be it's not going to be remembered for her amazing stats and the amazing numbers or records that she broke. It's only going to be remembered for the ACL injury and sidelining her for the season. And she ended up needing to get helped off the court after suffering the injury, and the Sparks ended up losing 79-70 to Connecticut on Tuesday. And Brink played under 4 minutes and committed one foul before getting hurt. So once over the sideline, she was sent towards the locker room, but was forced to stop as a result of the pain. A pair of Sparks personnel lifted Brink off of her feet and carried her to the locker room. She is the second overall pick in the WNBA draft, and she came into the game averaging 8 points, 5 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks. The rest of those counting stats weren't that impressive, but the 2.5 blocks is something that's impressive. And in her first season for LA, she was 4 for 11, and she tied Aja Wilson with the second most blocks in the WNBA. So that just shows you just how much of an elite talent she is compared to the rest of the veterans and the stars in the WNBA. We've seen it from Caitlyn, how Caitlyn gets all of these numbers, and how it took all of these WNBA athletes, either a long time, or there's not really many athletes that really have the numbers that she's averaged. Same thing can be said with Cameron Brink. I mean, averaging 2.5 blocks as a rookie, that is valuable. And it's somewhat I don't want to say it's the same story as Victor, because we only have a very small sort of playing pool. I mean, only 15 games of playing. That's not really enough to determine like, oh, her entire season is like Victor Wembanyama. But just the block standpoint, and from like just thinking about how many blocks she does average as as a rookie is very, very impressive. And that was one of the things that struck a lot of people's attention, not just Wemby's offense, but also Wemby's defense, being able to block shots at a very high rate. 2.5 blocks per game. That is very good. And like, I mean, it takes a lot for NBA players to average 2.5 blocks in a game. So the fact that she's able to do it as a rookie, it only shows signs of what's to come in the future and for the future of the WNBA. Because one of the things that a lot of the WNBA players benefit from in terms of defense is the fact that not a single one of them can dunk the basketball. Now, at least in game. I mean, it's rare that we see a WNBA player dunk the basketball in game, and it's a rare thing to see. So given that most of the time they're going to be taking layups, thus making it a lot easier, to block the shot, because if they're going to be going up with layups, you have a much greater height advantage when compared to the rest of the players in the league, and you don't have to worry about them, soaring high above the sky and still getting a dunk on you. And it just makes it a lot easier for them to, one, contest shots and as well block the shots, because they don't have to worry about a strong force like that. So now, the 2019 season, I've lost a starter to injury every single year. I've been a head coach in this league. This is what Kurt Miller said. You just have to have the mentality of next person up and rally around it. So that seems to be what the Sparks are going to be doing now that Brink is injured. Now, I'm not going to say that she was an incredibly valuable piece to the team, but going into the future, and it's important that you develop the players early and pray that they don't get in the injury phase that early, because if a player gets in the injury phase early, it's possible that it could be a trend for the rest of their career, and ultimately like that would be the main focal point of their career, their early on injuries, and how it prevented this, like it makes another what if story, and we don't want that coming from Brink. Granted, now we have, like, usually that's what those ACL injuries would indicate, especially early on. But now with the way that treatment and technology has advanced, it seems like a lot of people and a lot of players are returning from these injuries and like these kinds of injuries way quicker and way more efficiently than normally, I guess you could say, than like what you would expect. Something like when Kevin Durant went down and tore his Achilles, and everyone was like, this and that, and everyone was expecting that Kevin Durant wasn't going to be the same player that he was. He ended up returning and averaging better numbers than what he did when he didn't have that, or when he didn't suffer that injury. And you could make the same argument for Klay Thompson directly after suffering all of those injuries onto his knee. Remember, he suffered multiple injuries while he was rehabbing from his first injury, and that eventually slowed him down from returning. But he eventually returned and helped win the Golden State Warriors another championship in 2022, before, he got the reputation of being a choker and being bad in the clutch situations and not being the same player that he was several years ago. And, we see this a lot more often, how all these players, they're recovering from these injuries. So there's still hope for her and, her career in the NBA. That's most likely, not NBA, WNBA. It's most likely not going to end here, but still, it is something that's very scary to think about. She was also on the Team USA's 3x3 team for the Paris Olympics, and a replacement will have to be named for her, which is another thing that was going to get overlooked in the WNBA season and her injury, because she was going to be part of the Olympics, and now that she's injured, she's not going to be a part of the Olympics. And the Sparks, they had to play New York in 2 games on Thursday and Saturday, and the Liberty, they are a very, very good team in the WNBA. They are one of the best teams in the WNBA with the stars that they have, Brenna Stewart and Sabrina Ionescu. Those two players are fantastic. They're great basketball players, and they're great for the game. And they, I feel like the Sparks, they're going to have a challenge. They were going to have a challenge even with Cameron Brink on the roster. But yeah, that's basically the injury, and hopefully she recovers very quickly, and hopefully this doesn't, become a trend for a majority of her career as she continues to play in the WNBA and continues to break these records and continues, well, not really, she hasn't really broken any records yet, but I'm very, very hopeful that she will, given her talent and the draft class that she's a part of. So with that, we are out of time for this first segment, excuse me. So now we will go ahead and go into the second segment where I give a quick recap of the conference finals, my opinions on, all the games, and my opinions on what the teams are going to do, what should be next for these teams, and just what I see them accomplishing in the next season. So I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network, and we are back with the second segment, and in this second segment, we are going to be doing a quick recap of the conference finals and just all the games that went down, and, well, not really all the games that went down, but, the series and my opinions on all of the series and how they went. I'm just going to realign this real quick so that way it doesn't look weird standing all the way over to the left. And for those of you on the podcast section, you guys can't see it, but the title, it was a little bit towards the headline under the ticker was a little bit towards the left, and I didn't really like it. So with that, we are going to go ahead and talk about the conference finals in both the East and the West. Before I begin, I'd like to remind everybody to please use the link in the description to get your comments recognized, or the link displayed below the ticker on every single show segment. That is GSMCPodcast.net. It really helps the show, makes it much more interactive between myself and you guys. Once again, the link is GSMCPodcast.net. And with that out of the way, let's go right ahead and review the postseason and the conference finals in both the East and in the Western Conference Finals. So we'll start with the West first because I felt like that series was definitely way more competitive than the Eastern Conference series. So obviously the Dallas Mavericks, they ended up winning the series in a hard-fought series against the Timberwolves, and they ended up winning in 5 games, which was a lot quicker than what I originally had thought was going to happen between the Dallas Mavericks and the Timberwolves. And one of the biggest things that is really underlooked in the postseason, I feel like, at least up until the very end, is that the postseason is all about matchups. And the team that has the best matchups against another team is most likely going to advance to the next round. And that doesn't mean that the team that lost is going to be worse than the teams that advance. It just means that the teams that they lost to had a bit of a better matchup, and they took advantage of that matchup with better coaching and all of these sort of extra things that implemented into that win, more so than just being flat out better than the other team. This is why a lot of the media and a lot of opinions towards the end of the playoffs, they changed, because before we weren't hearing the story, we weren't hearing the thought that Dallas was going to lose in the finals. Nobody really thought that, and no one was really banking on that. There was still hope. Now that they ended up losing, everyone's saying that, like, Timberwolves would have been a better matchup, or the Denver Nuggets would have been a better matchup, and they probably would have made the finals a little bit more competitive than the Dallas Mavericks. And part of that is true, because part of that means that the matchups that the rest of those teams have would be better fit for the situation in playing Boston in a series, because that's ultimately what it comes down to, just the situation that you're in and the matchups that you have, what you can expose and how often you can expose it. And that's exactly what the Dallas Mavericks did when going up against the Timberwolves. They exposed their lack of perimeter defense between the two big men, and they used that to their advantage, because one of the problems with the Timberwolves lineup and their big man lineup was the ability to guard the perimeter, as well as, you know, being able to guard a point guard that knows how to run a pick and roll very well and abuse the mismatches. Because one of the things that the Mavericks were doing against the Timberwolves throughout the entirety of the series was abusing matchups, and particularly matchups when Rudy Gobert or Karl Anthony Towns would end up being switched onto Luka or Kyrie. And once those big men ended up guarding either one of those guys outside of the perimeter, they ended up getting destroyed. And that was one of the things that the Denver Nuggets couldn't do when matched up against the Timberwolves. Their main focal points, and, like, you know, the main piece of the Nuggets and their offense was Nikola Jokic. And being the fact that Rudy Gobert and Kat are both centers, it's easier for them to guard them, as opposed to, and being able to guard Jokic, as opposed to needing to guard two perimeter players that are fantastic with the ball. And that was sort of a thing that the Timberwolves struggled with, because while they do have Anthony Edwards as a competent perimeter defender, they didn't really have anyone else on the team that would be able to stop or slow down either Luka or Kyrie Irving. On top of the fact, Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns not being able to shoot very well in the postseason, that also played a major factor in the series, and sort of why the Timberwolves couldn't end up winning a single game, because, like, the games were close, and, like, you know, the series, it was really close in the beginning, but the biggest problem was that the Timberwolves weren't capitalizing with their scorers. And if you're not going to, that was one of the biggest things about the Timberwolves, the fact that they were able to play really good defense on all of the teams that played in the postseason, aside from those two, because it's really difficult to guard Luka and Kyrie when they're both on an island, and when Rudy Gobert is guarding him. That was a game-winning shot that Luka Doncic took over Rudy Gobert, and that sort of summarized the entirety of the postseason. The fact that Rudy Gobert was unable to guard the pick and roll, unable to guard Luka on a switch, unable to guard Kyrie on a switch, and that was the big reason as to why the Dallas Mavericks were actually able to win the series in the end, on top of the fact that Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns shot very poorly. So what I see going in, like, into the future with the Timberwolves is probably getting a bit more perimeter defenders to sort of help the team, and on that defensive side of the ball, because in the paint you could argue that they have a very solid paint presence. I mean, Rudy Gobert, there's, like, still, his paint presence is a bit iffy in my opinion. It's like up and down. It changes like every single game, because, you know, you have one game where someone could, like Jokic, he dropped 40 on him, and then you could have another game where he ends up stopping Jokic, like how it happened in the series. But that's sort of what I feel like, and that was like the big reason why I think the Mavericks were able to win in this series, just abusing that matchup and being able to play that matchup to the best of their ability. And the fact that Kyrie and Luka were able to have great games on top of that while abusing that and being consistent also plays into a factor. So really, the Timberwolves, they could have won that series, but they just needed their offensive stars to be a bit more consistent when playing the Dallas Mavericks. And you have to, so for the Timberwolves, they have to be better in the postseason and better in those situations. And they have to be a little bit better on the perimeter side in terms of defense. They need to get better on the perimeter aspect of defense. And that's really like the biggest, that was really like the biggest thing. I mean, like, because Anthony Edwards getting called like Michael Jordan's son in the postseason didn't help matters at all, and didn't help, like, I feel like that added more pressure to the Timberwolves, and adding more pressure onto yourself in the postseason is not ideal, and it's not something that they should be doing. This was the same problem that Boston has had for several years, constantly having all of this pressure and these expectations. And now that they didn't have, they still had a lot of pressure, but now that everyone was sort of expecting them to lose, they didn't really have that much pressure. And, you know, it all just plays in. It all plays a huge factor into the postseason. And I'm not going to spend that much time on the Eastern Conference Finals because that series ended up being a sweep. I think the Celtics were just overall the better team. And it didn't matter what matchups the Pacers had, the Celtics could easily counter that. And it didn't matter who was playing bad against the Pacers, the Celtics could easily counter that with the great roster that they had. So that there's really nothing that needs to be like talked about with the Eastern Conference final series, because that series was over in 4 games, and the Celtics made quick work of the Pacers. So I don't really think there's like a need to sit on that game and talk about it for a long time, as much as it was to talk about this Mavericks series, because there was a lot of things that I felt like the Timberwolves could have done in that series to ultimately win them the series in the end. They just didn't do it. Pacers, on the other hand, while they did have multiple opportunities to win the game in the end, and in a couple of games, I mean, they had 92% odds in a couple of games to end up winning because they were up by a considerable amount in the fourth quarter, and they ended up choking it away. And I feel like the Celtics, with their defense and their offense, they would have been able to counter anything that the Pacers would have thrown at them. And the only thing that was really going to make the Celtics lose was if the Pacers were hitting shots and the Celtics weren't. But the Celtics defense was able to like slow the Pacers offense down a little bit for them to keep up and eventually win in 4 games. So not really much that needs to be covered on that side of the conference finals. So that's the conference finals recap. So next we will be going ahead into the third segment where I recap the conference semifinals. So it's going to be a little bit more in depth with the Nuggets matchup between the Timberwolves, as well as the rest of the matchups that happen in the postseason as well. So I will be talking about that in the third segment. So be sure to stay tuned right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
And we are back with the third segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this next segment, we are going to be talking about the conference semifinals and all of the matchups that ended up happening in that series. So we'll just be talking about my opinions on the teams, how they played, what they did that ended up working, and what they should do in the next season to ultimately get where they want to be and win the championship. So I was talking a little bit about the Nuggets series and how the Timberwolves were able to use their big men to their advantage and sort of slow down Jokic enough for a couple of games and ended up winning the series in the end when they ultimately ended up playing rather poorly towards the end of the series. So like I said before, the matchup between like the Denver Nuggets and the Timberwolves, it was a much better matchup than the Timberwolves needed when they were compared to when they were going up against the Dallas Mavericks. Like they had the positions down in this series. And like I mean the Timberwolves, like, you know, their best player is the center, and the Timberwolves, their best defender is the center. So it's like you have a great offensive talent being guarded by a great defensive talent. So that ultimately cancels the two of them out a little bit. Again, only a little bit, because it's all down to how the defender performs and how the offensive player performs, and just when they have a good game and when they have a good game at the right time. And that's sort of like they were able to hold off the Denver Nuggets just enough to ultimately propel them to win the series in the end. And they ended up blowing them out by a huge margin at home in Game 6, which was like, you know, it was the big statement game for them, and it ensured them that they were going to Game 7, which was very, very important for them. And they also, like, again, it was really down to Jokic playing very, very well. And I'll say, like, Jokic, he got very inconsistent and couldn't close out the rest of the series in the final game. And that ultimately sort of, like, decided the outcome of this series. So, like, really, I feel like the Nuggets, they were, like, the fact that they just lost that game and they lost that series, I think it's more like, you know, the Timberwolves, they just had the better matchups and they were the better team at the right time. Because in Game 7, when it's all said, when like literally the entire series is just determined by that one game, the Nuggets, they were up by so much, but then they couldn't close out that final game. And so really the biggest issue with Denver is the fact that they just couldn't close out. And the Timberwolves, they just took that to their advantage, and they had the matchups to continue on the series early, and that's ultimately what propelled them to win the series in the end. Just being able to stay alive long enough so that the Nuggets ended up being the downfall of their own success. And that's sort of like, I mean, that was the theme with Game 7, just the fact that Jokic couldn't really score the ball that efficiently, and neither could Jamal Murray after a certain period of time. And that's really where like where like their problem sort of started, I guess you could say, when they just couldn't close out. And just not being able to close out is a huge, and it's a very important factor in these kinds of series. Now, let's move on to the next series in the Western Conference, which was the Thunder against the Dallas Mavericks. So the Thunder, they went into this series as the number 1 seed, and the Mavericks, they went into this series as the number 5 seed. However, the Mavericks also entered the postseason with playoff experience, and I think that was the biggest factor in this entire postseason between between that matchup between the Mavericks and the Thunder. It's just the fact that the Thunder and the rest of the players didn't really have that much experience playing in such a high leverage game. Shai was fantastic in the series, but he was the only real player that was doing anything on that team. And being the youngest team to ever take the 1 seed, it's, you know, that's obviously a lot of pressure. And expecting them to go far early, like in their careers, against a much more experienced team in the postseason, even though they were the 1 seed, it's not really like something common that happens. So I really think it comes down to just the Thunder's lack of experience and the Mavericks with all of their experience in this series. Like they were able to win 2 games in the series, the Thunder, so that's always good, props to them. But aside from that, it was like I really feel like the Mavericks, they just outdid them in terms of efficiency, and they also outdid them in terms of the experience. And it was just experience and the fact that they only had one star doing majority of the work that ultimately it costed them. So that's the Western Conference, and the reason why I think the Mavericks were able to prevail in that series against the Thunder. So let's move on to the Eastern Conference, where we talk about the teams that matched up in the Eastern Conference semifinals. So between the Celtics and the Cavs, honestly, I had a feeling from the beginning that the Celtics were going to win the series just because of just how much better they were as a team compared to the Cavs, how much more complete their roster was, and how much more they played with each other compared to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Because most of the time throughout the season, the Cavs, they were fighting injuries. Darius Garland was injured, Donovan Mitchell was injured, and they didn't really play as much games together as they would like to be able to go up against the Celtics. Not to mention the fact that the Celtics have elite perimeter defenders, which were great matchups to be able to counter the offense that the Cleveland Cavaliers were going to sort of try and use on them. And they were able to win 1 game, but that ultimately didn't decide the series. And it was just the fact that the Celtics, they had the better roster, they had the better players, and they had much more experience than that Cavs team. On top of the fact that the Cavs team was also like, it had locker room drama with the coach as well. All of those things played out into this loss, and I don't think they would have ended up winning against the Celtics. So not really much that needs to be talked about in that series. Now let's go on to the Knicks and the Pacers series, which is something that I really, really want to talk about, because that series, I think it came down to injuries. The fact that the Knicks were injured and they were playing with an injured roster compared to when the Pacers, they were playing against a healthy roster. And the fact that the Knicks, they weren't able to hit any kind of shot in Game 7, while the Pacers had a historic Game 7, that was the reason why they ultimately ended up winning the series. And injuries and just a fluky good performance coming in from the Pacers, because I call it fluky because it's never happened in the history of the postseason. Not a single team was able to shoot over 75% in a Game 7 to close out the game. On top of that, the pressure of the Knicks and playing at home, it gets to them. Now, I know it's like, why would they get pressured playing at home? That doesn't make any sense. But as a Knick player, like I say this so many times, other players, they circle the Madison Square Garden on their calendar, and they have that game marked as a game that they want to absolutely succeed and perform in. So when you have that kind of mentality of going into like a game, it affects the rest of the players, because it's like you're zoned in trying to play very well in Madison Square Garden. You have that calendar day prepped. Every single home game for them is a playoff game, and it's like incredibly exhausting, and it's not something that they can sustain long term. And that's sort of like the big reason as to why I thought on top of the fact that it was just a crazy good performance in Game 7, that was like, the big reason why I thought the Knicks ended up losing that series. Just the fact that it came down to a Game 7, and none of the players on the Knicks were healthy. I mean, Josh Hart, he was suffering through injuries. OG was also suffering through injuries, and it affected the team. And all these important pieces that they needed on the team to go up against these guys, it wasn't enough. And I feel like that was the big reason as to why the Knicks ultimately ended up losing this series. And I really feel like that if they were healthy, they wouldn't have lost the series. I genuinely believe that, because this Pacers team, it was very, very good against the it was good. They were good, but only against like the injured teams. And I'll go ahead and explain that a little bit more in depth in the next section, where I'm going to talk about I'll talk about the Eastern Conference and the first round and those matchups and why like I think they lost. But really, the Knicks, all they have to do is make sure that they're healthy, and they could make a legitimate run in the next season. I've said it before, I really think that this Knicks roster, when they're healthy, is enough to be able to beat the Boston Celtics if they capitalize and if they play well in these very, very key and highly important games. So that's really all I have for this third segment. And what other teams did I talk about? So yeah, with the Thunder, it's the lack of experience. With the Nuggets, it was the fact that they couldn't close out in Game 7. With the Knicks, it was the injuries, and with the Cavs, like they just had a better team. Like the Celtics just had a better team going up against the Cavs. So that's the recap of the semi-conference finals. So now we will go ahead and do a whole playoff recap of the Eastern Conference first round and what is like expected for the rest of the teams. So I will be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
And we are back with the fourth segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this fourth segment, we are going to be talking about the first round of the postseason, and we're specifically going to be talking about the Eastern Conference and those matchups and sort of why I feel like, the teams ended up losing, the reason why they ended up losing, things of that nature, what I feel like they should do going into the next season, and all of that stuff. So we'll go ahead and start with the most competitive series in the entirety of the first round, and arguably the most competitive series in the entirety of the playoffs, the Cavs going up against the Magic. So this was one of the few series in the postseason that ended up going to 7 games. Now, this is one of 3 because, Timberwolves, they ended up going to 7 games with the Nuggets, and the Pacers ended up going to 7 games with the Knicks. And this was the first series that ended up going to 7 games. This was the longest series that ended up going to 7 games. And it was also arguably the least watched series in the entirety of the first round, which I find is kind of, crazy how a series that's this competitive didn't get this much coverage in the postseason. And one of the things that could have affected that was the timing of when these games occurred. Like the Cavs and the Magic, they sometimes played as early as 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and not many people are going to be watching the TV and tuning in at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There's other things that they have to do, other jobs, things of that nature, and it's not prime time TV. And that's sort of I feel like that might have helped the Magic in this series, because they didn't really have any kind of media coverage throughout the entirety of the season. There was barely any pressure on them to do any kind of good work in the postseason, and there was no pressure on them to even have a good season. So despite that, however, this series was back and forth. The Cavs, they won the 2 home games, and the Magic won the home game. Then the Cavs won their home game, then the Magic won their home game, and then the Cavs won the final home game. So it was really a battle of home court advantage and who was going to take advantage of that. And one of the things that I feel like both of the teams really suffered from was the lack of experience in the postseason. The Cavs, they had, as a team, they really only played 1 year together in the postseason, and that was the previous year. And playing 1 year in the postseason, that's not enough to sort of develop a team into the championship caliber team that you want them to be. And there's obviously more chemistry issues that go along with that as well. But the fact that the Magic had a little bit less playoff experience and that they didn't have home court advantage was the ultimate reason why they didn't win the series. And I don't think this Magic team would have been enough to make it and win in the second round. And I don't think either one of the teams was going to beat the Celtics. Like, this was really just the fact that they ended up matching up against the Celtics, and the Celtics are a bad matchup for any team in the Eastern Conference Finals. And it's like, really, if the Celtics go down, like, the story of the Eastern Conference was, if the Celtics go down, it's anyone's game. Because I don't think any team with the current state that they were in was going to be able to put up a fight against the Boston Celtics. That's just me. And that's really like the big reason why I feel like, I don't really need to talk about this series all that much, because I think they would have lost anyway going up against the Celtics this year. So going into the next year, really they have to hope that Paolo has like the same type of season that he did, and was playing he was playing very well in the postseason. So they really just need more pieces centered around Paolo, and that is, the ultimate goal. Next series in the Eastern Conference is the Celtics against the Miami Heat. Now, I'm not really going to dwindle on this series too much, because I genuinely think that if the Heat were healthy, it doesn't matter. The Celtics were going to end up winning the series. Now, it probably would have been a little bit more competitive, but I still think the Celtics would have ultimately won the series in the end, because this series ended in 5 games. They got lucky playing very well in Game 2, while the Celtics were playing pretty bad in Game 2, and that was the reason why they ultimately ended up winning 1 game in the series and they did not get swept. And that was sort of like, a common theme in the postseason at the time, the Celtics losing in Game 2 after winning by a lot in Game 1. But, just the fact that Jimmy Butler wasn't on the team, it really costed them the series. It would have made it more competitive, but I don't think they would have ended up winning the series against the Celtics. That's just me, though. So no need to really dwindle on that series. I think the Celtics were going to win from the jump. So next on the list is the Pacers going up against the Bucks. And this is the same story that I said when the Pacers went up against the Knicks. The biggest problem and the biggest reason why the Bucks didn't ultimately make it to the next round was the fact that Giannis was injured, and then shortly after, Damian Lillard went down with an injury as well. And that ultimately, it crippled the franchise, and it's sort of like they weren't going to win without Giannis, and they weren't going to win without Dame. And they lost both of them in this series. And that was really the ultimate reason why I think the Pacers sort of ended up being able to win this series in 6 games. Because, like, they struggled against a Bucks team. Like, they struggled to beat a Bucks team that didn't have Dame and didn't have Giannis. So I really think that if Giannis and Dame were active throughout the entirety of the postseason, this series would have played out a little bit differently, and the Bucks would have been the one going up against the Knicks, not the Pacers. And I also think that the Bucks, they also have, when they're healthy, I really think that they would have had a pretty good chance in beating the Knicks, or making the Knicks series just as competitive. It's just Doc Rivers being their head coach and the lack of adjustments, I knew that was going to hold them and prevent them from making it far. And that's really the fact that they were injured, and the fact that they have Doc Rivers as their coach is like the biggest killers to the Bucks, and that's like the biggest reason why I feel like they didn't make it far in the postseason. And what they should do in the next season is, like, hopefully learn from these injuries. Hopefully Damian Lillard, like, because another aspect of Damian Lillard's game was that he wasn't the same player that he was from Portland. And Doc Rivers, he said before that Damian Lillard, he sort of how do I say this? He sort of took a little bit of he didn't work out that much in the offseason when he was about to get traded to the Milwaukee Bucks, because he was afraid of getting injured. And that played into, his play in the postseason. He was ridiculously out of shape. That's what he said. That's what he told Doc. And the fact that he was out of shape played into the season, and how he just wasn't the same player that he was. So Dame has to get back in shape with the Bucks. Giannis has to be sure to stay healthy, and Doc Rivers has to learn from his coaching mistakes, and that's how the Bucks are going to eventually advance and would have a chance in beating the Celtics in a series, for next year. And that's sort of what they need to look for next year. Just make sure that they can keep Giannis healthy, and make sure that they can get Dame at 100%, so that way he could play the best, because this team was doing really good things with Dame, despite the fact that Dame wasn't really playing that well in the regular season whatsoever. He did get selected to be an all-star starter, but I feel like that all-star starting position could have been rewarded to somebody else on the Eastern Conference. So that's really the three things that the Bucks need to work on. Now, next was the Knicks going up against the 76ers. Now, the 76ers, they are notorious for losing before the Eastern Conference Finals round, so this was really no different for them. And the big problem was matchups. The fact that they were the 7th seed in the entirety of the Eastern Conference, the biggest reason why they were so low was because Joel Embiid got injured mid-season. And so, really, if they want to get farther, they're going to have to be sure to take a high seed in the postseason, so that way they can go up against one of those low-seeded teams and give them a better chance of winning the series in the end. And that's my thought process, and that's sort of the reason why I think the Sixers didn't end up winning this series. Granted, I don't think the Sixers were going to win a series because of Joel Embiid and just how he plays in the postseason. Like, that's just my overall opinion on the Sixers. I don't like how Embiid plays in the postseason, and his play in the postseason, it declines almost every single time, and he's also not healthy. So the big thing that the Sixers have to focus on is making sure that Joel Embiid is healthy throughout all of the season. And that's throughout every single postseason, Joel Embiid has been injured, and that's not ideal. You can't have your best player injured in every single postseason that you play in, because that ultimately affects his play. And that hinders you from making it farther. It's really the fact that he always gets injured. And the pieces on the team as well, they weren't playing well either. And so Tobias Harris, he was a no-show in the elimination game. And really, the Sixers, what they need to do, they need to make sure that he's healthy, Joel Embiid's healthy. They need to make sure that they have good enough pieces, and those pieces perform in the right moments at the right time. And one of the biggest things that they're going to have to do this offseason, if they want any kind of success, is getting Paul George or a big-time free agent with all the cap space that they're going to have. So that's what I think the Sixers need to do, and for the next season and moving forward. Just make sure that Joel Embiid is healthy, and make sure that you're able to get Paul George in free agency, thus giving you a better chance of winning. Because if you can get a trio of Paul George, Tyrese Maxey, and Joel Embiid, that's a very solid trio, and that it could propel them to go farther into the postseason than they've ever gone. So that's my opinions, and Joel Embiid just needs to stay healthy, and the style of play that he has in the postseason needs to be adjusted, because foul baiting and constantly looking for fouls is not the way to go. That's just me, though. So that's all I have for the fourth segment. So now we will go ahead and go into the fifth segment, where we talk about the Western Conference side of the first round, and just the opinions that I have on the Western Conference and what I think the teams need to do in order to make it far. So I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned. And we are back with the fifth segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this fifth segment, we are going to be looking at the first round of the Western Conference and we are going to just be analyzing the round and see exactly like what the teams need in order to be successful in the next season, what I expect them to do, and things of that nature. So we'll start with the Phoenix Suns and the Timberwolves and their series. I did not expect this series to end in a sweep. I figured the Suns would put up a little bit more of a fight against the Timberwolves, and I genuinely didn't think that the Timberwolves were going to be able to sweep the Suns just based off of the talent that the Suns have and, the ability that the Timberwolves have to defend the perimeter. I genuinely thought that the Suns would be able to maintain a consistent enough offense to be able to win the series, but they weren't able to keep up with they weren't able to perform really well on the offense at all. Like they didn't score 100 points until game 3 in the series, and they just weren't able to keep up with the Timberwolves in terms of scoring. I mean, game 1, 120 to 95. Game 2, 105 to 93. Game 3, 126 to 109. And the biggest problem with the Suns was the fact that they were like relying on that star power and that isolation type of basketball play to win this series. And while it worked for the Mavericks a little bit, it's not really easy to maintain that kind of offense long term. And it's not easy to just be that consistent long term, especially in a high leverage series and a high leverage game like the postseason. And the fact that the Suns didn't have like a strong enough defense to be able to counter the Timberwolves is another thing that I felt like they suffered in this game and in this series. It was just the lack of defense coming in from the Suns and ultimately their lack of offensive production as well. If you're not going to have defense, you need to at least be able to perform on the offensive side of the ball. And having only 3 players that can do anything with the ball, and the fact that all 3 of those players take the most inefficient shot in the NBA, contested mid-ranges and, mid-range pull-ups, that also didn't help them in the series. Like, if you're constantly looking for that shot when you're looking for your offense to get rolling, it's very difficult to get into a rhythm. And you need to take a little bit more efficient shots, and your teammates also have to be taking those efficient shots. And it's just the fact that every single one of those players on the big 3, Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal, the fact that they all take those contested mid-range shots, it's not a good shot, and it's not really a shot that they can live with taking long term. And that's that's ultimately my opinion on this series. It's just the fact that their offense and the game plan that they had going in, and the fact that Bradley Beal just wasn't a factor in the closeout game in game 4. It's like all of these things, and it's like it's the same story with the Brooklyn Nets, really, in my opinion. And it's like that offense isn't going to be sustainable long term if you don't have a good enough defense for that. And it comes down to those 3 players just not playing well at the right moment. And it's like really that's all what it comes down to, because that's really the biggest problem with isolation offense. It's like, what happens if if all of your players that run the isolation just don't end up hitting their shots? And that was the same story with Brooklyn in game 2 when they were up by so much. Kevin Durant and Kyrie, they were taking the shots that they would normally make, they just weren't making them. And that's really where the big issue comes in with the series. And I don't really expect the Suns to be able to do much with this big 3, especially since they traded away so many pieces to get that big 3. They're really putting themselves in a tough spot to be able to do anything in the future, especially with, Kevin Durant's not getting any younger. And, while Devin Booker is relatively young, he's also not getting any younger. And, it's just, I feel like all of these, and wasting all of their draft capital on just to be able to get Kevin Durant, it wasn't ideal either. So that's really my opinions. And KD on the Suns and KD on any other team that isn't the Warriors has been struggling. So I don't really know what the Suns can do to really fix that. Now, the Lakers series, on the other hand, oh my Lord, I have a lot to say on that series, because that series was ridiculous. And the reason why the Lakers lost that series, the biggest reason, I can't think of any other reason other than bad luck. It's that simple. Bad luck. Now, Jamal Murray, he turns into the best player in the world when going up against the Lakers. The shooting efficiency from the team going up against the Lakers was ridiculous. And when you compare their shooting splits against the Lakers and compare that to their shooting splits against any other team that they've played in the postseason, whether it be this year, whether it be last year, whether it be the year before, whether it be the year before that, they did not shoot nearly as efficiently and nearly as good as they did when going up against the Lakers. I don't know what it is with Denver. They just turn into a different animal when going up against the Lakers. And the fact that D'Angelo Russell was playing really, really bad in the postseason didn't help anything. So I genuinely think the Lakers, other than the fact that D'Angelo Russell was bad and Darvin Ham is also really bad, they got destroyed, and it was bad luck because the shots that the Nuggets were hitting were ridiculous. They're crazy difficult, and they're able to hit, and they were able to do it at a consistent rate. And this was the same story last year. Like, the Nuggets, they just hit some of the craziest shots imaginable when going up against the Lakers. And when you look at the numbers and just how much better they shoot going up against the Lakers compared to every other team, especially Jamal Murray in particular, it's staggering. It is crazy how efficient they shoot, and it's literally you can't really boil it down to anything other than bad luck, because shooting, while it is partly skill, it's also luck, because it's a make or miss league, and they were just making every single shot. And that was the big reason, because realistically they had the matchups. They had LeBron. Obviously LeBron is good against any kind of matchup. Anthony Davis is a good enough rim protector to be able to slow down Nikola Jokic. Well, not the best rim protector, just good enough to be able to slow him down just a little bit. But it's just the fact that Jamal Murray and the rest of the Nuggets, along with Jokic, they were hitting some of the craziest shots. And there's really there was no team in the history of the league that would have beaten the Nuggets in either of those series, because of just how crazy they were hitting the shots and just how often they were hitting those shots. So that's my opinions on that first round matchup and why the Lakers ultimately ended up losing, because it's the shooting splits were ridiculous. I wish I had the exact numbers talking about the shooting splits. I might do a completely different I might do a whole new segment just talking about why are the Nuggets so much better playing against LA than any other team? And then I'll show you those numbers, because they're ridiculous. I don't have them off the top of my head, however. So next series is the Clippers against the Mavericks. This was the first series where James Harden actually played better in the postseason as opposed to how he plays in the regular season. However, he also had a stinker performance in one of these playoff games. I believe it was Game 5 and in the closeout Game 6, where he always has these flame out performances. It's every single season with him. So it's while his averages were better, it's not like he changed his ways in the postseason. So that's and the fact that they're the Clippers, it also doesn't help things either. The Clippers, they have a history of losing these big games. They have a history of losing in series when they're supposedly supposed to win. They were the favorites of making it to the finals in some part of the season. I believe it was the middle of the season when they got James Harden. And it's just the fact that they have these expectations, and the Clippers as an organization, they just don't ever meet them. Not to mention the fact that Kawhi Leonard was also injured for the postseason, which also ended up hurting things for the Clippers. And it ultimately, it decided the series, the fact that Kawhi Leonard wasn't going to be playing in some of these games. And really, that's been the issue with the Clippers, the fact that they're never able to get both Kawhi and Paul George to be healthy in the same postseason. And that's been the issue for the Clippers for the longest time, since having Kawhi and Paul George, and the fact that they're just unable to close out important games. So really, the Clippers, they have to hopefully extend, re-sign Paul George and give him that max contract, And, maybe they can get Harden as well and try to compete yet again. But they really have to work on closing out games. They have to work on closing out the series. And they really, really have to work on making sure that Kawhi and Paul George are healthy for the postseason, which is the biggest issue that the Clippers have had for the longest time in the Paul George and the Kawhi Leonard era. Just the fact that they keep getting injured. And next on the list of series is the Thunder going up against the Pelicans. Not really much that needs to be said because, while the Thunder didn't have experience, the Pelicans also barely had experience playing in the postseason. On top of the fact that they didn't have Zion, on top of the fact that they lost Zion in the play-in game when the Pelicans were up against the Lakers. And that ultimately, it crippled the franchise, and it's losing your best player on your team going into the postseason, it's never a good sign. And the fact that Zion is one of the primary scorers and they lost one of their primary scorers is a big reason why I think this series wasn't that competitive. So I can't really give a good scale as to what the Pelicans should do other than make sure that Zion stays healthy and he stays in shape, because that was the biggest killer with Zion, and that's the big reason why a lot of people don't really think Zion is going to develop, because of his status with the team and his status with his eating habits, his status with his health, all of those things. And I think that if Zion was in this series, it would have been a little bit more competitive. So I'm not really going to give the Pelicans any kind of scrutiny, because losing your best player on your team, it's not really fair to judge another team's season and their little bit of success going into in the postseason if their best player isn't available to them. So really, I think the chemistry between these guys just has to be a little bit better, and Zion has to stay a little bit healthy. Maybe they could make their roster slightly better if they engage in trade talks in the offseason. We'll see what they do, but this roster that they have, it's not a bad roster. They do lack a rim protector, which is something that I expect them to get and pursue in the free agency market, but the fact that they're just, they're inexperienced and they didn't have their best player, I feel like that was the biggest reason why they ended up losing that series, especially losing in a sweep. It's really just because they didn't have their best players. And if Zion was in there, I think the series would have been a little bit more competitive. And if they, granted, I really feel like, this team could be destined to do great things with the players that they have. They just need to get better chemistry, and they need to play a little bit more together, because, Zion has had an issue of staying healthy in the regular season as well. So I really feel like all of those factors need to be taken into account when judging the Pelicans, and maybe they can get better in the offseason. So that's really my opinions on the entirety of the playoffs and the matchups, and why I feel like the matchups ended up going the way that they did, and what the teams need to do to sort of fix it. Because not every team can fix their solution. Some teams, they might have to rework their roster and things of that nature. But in reality, it's all down to just how the matchups go and how you play in when your team desperately needs you to play well. And that's the big story in every single postseason. So that's all I have for you on this podcast. That's the end of this segment. Thank you so much for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram for more content and updates. As usual, please remember to use the link in the description to get your comments recognized, or the link displayed below the ticker on every single show segment. That is GSMCPodcast.net. It really helps the show. It makes the show more interactive between myself and you guys. That is all I have for you in this podcast today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am your host, Nelson, and as always, take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't that